For 7 years Evelyn Mercer's porch light stayed dark, every single night. Then, on a rainy November evening, she opened her front door, and found a tiny lantern glowing beside the bottom step. Underneath it, was a handwritten note, only 6 words. You don't have to use his, if quiet stories about kindness, and the things people carry in silence, mean something to you, stay with me until the end. Evelyn Mercer was 72, she had lived in the same small house. For more than 40 years, it stood on a peaceful street. The houses were close enough for neighbors to wave from their kitchens. Years ago, Evelyn always waved back. She was the woman who grew too many tomatoes every summer. She left paper bags of them on neighbors' doorsteps, she remembered birthdays, she baked something, whenever a new family moved onto the street, and on warm evenings, Evelyn and her husband Henry would sit together on the porch. They stayed there until the mosquitoes finally drove them inside. Then Henry died. And slowly, Evelyn began to disappear from the neighborhood, not all at once, there was no single day when she decided she wanted to be alone. She simply stopped doing little things. First, she stopped sitting on the porch, then, she stopped growing tomatoes. When neighbors invited her to dinner, she usually found a polite reason not to go. After a while, people stopped asking so often, but there was one thing everyone noticed, the porch light. Evelyn never turned it on. The bulb worked, everyone knew that. More than one helpful neighbor had offered to replace it. Evelyn always gave the same answer. No thank you. It's fine. Soon, people began making their own explanations. Maybe Evelyn disliked visitors, maybe she was trying to save electricity, maybe she simply did not care anymore. Children selling things for school, learned to skip the dark house. Neighbors walking their dogs after sunset, rarely stopped at her gate, and without anyone meaning for it to happen. Evelyn's dark porch began to look like a message. Please, don't come here. But that was never what Evelyn meant. Truth was something she had never known how to explain. Henry had installed that porch light himself, shortly after they bought the house. To anyone else, it was just a light fixture, but to Evelyn, it was part of a ritual. For 36 years, whenever Evelyn went somewhere after sunset, Henry turned that light on. Before she came home, a late meeting, dinner with a friend, a trip to the grocery store, it did not matter. When Evelyn drove around the corner, she would see that warm yellow light, waiting for her. And usually, Henry would be somewhere behind it, sometimes at the window, sometimes opening the door, before she even reached the steps. Once, Evelyn teased him about it. She told him he acted like she was a teenager, who needed someone watching over her. Henry laughed, then he said, "It isn't for you to see the porch." He smiled. "It's so you know somebody's waiting." After Henry was gone, Evelyn tried turning the light on once, just once. She lasted less than a minute. The light fell across his empty chair, across the place where his shoes used to sit, across a porch where nobody was waiting anymore. Evelyn reached for the switch, turned it off. She never turned it on again. 7 years later, George Bennett moved into the small house across the street. George was 65. He had recently retired after many years doing maintenance work at a public school. He was quiet, practical, the kind of man who repaired a loose fence board before anyone asked him to. George had lost his wife several years earlier, so he understood something about grief. Grief did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it lived inside ordinary things, a coffee mug, an empty side of a closet, a song you could no longer listen to. George noticed Evelyn's dark porch, but he did not assume that it meant she wanted the whole world to stay away. He had seen her carrying groceries inside alone. He noticed that she sometimes waved when she thought nobody was looking. And one morning, after a windstorm covered the street with branches, George watched Evelyn spend nearly 20 minutes picking small pieces off the sidewalk. She did it so the children walking to school would not trip. George thought about that. A person who wanted nothing to do with people probably would not do something like that. So George started saying hello, nothing more. "Morning, Evelyn. Looks like rain. Cold one today." At first, Evelyn answered with only a word or two, but George never pushed. He never asked why she stayed inside. He never asked why the porch remained dark. Then one afternoon, George saw Evelyn struggling with a heavy bag of garden soil. Near her back gate, he walked over and carried it for her. Inside the garage, George noticed several dusty gardening tools, leaning against the wall. "You used to garden?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the tools. "My husband and I did." George nodded. He did not tell her. she should start again. He did not say, Henry would want her to be happy. Instead, he looked at the old tools, and said, looks like you two were serious about it. For the first time, Evelyn smiled. Henry thought 6 tomato plants were the minimum. George smiled back. That sounds dangerous. Evelyn laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. Over the next few weeks, they spoke from time to time, never for very long, just small conversations. Then one evening, George returned a casserole dish Evelyn had loaned him. It was already getting dark. When Evelyn opened the door, George noticed a framed photograph. On a small table inside, a younger Evelyn stood beside Henry, on the porch, and above them, the porch light was glowing. George looked at the photograph then. Just for a moment, his eyes moved toward the dark light outside. He did not ask about it, but Evelyn noticed. They all think it's broken, she said. George looked back at her. Evelyn hesitated. Then, for reasons she could not quite explain, she told him the truth. She told him about Henry, about how he always turned the light on when she was coming home, and she told George what Henry used to say. So you know somebody's waiting. Evelyn looked toward the dark porch. The first time I turned it on after he died, she said softly. It felt wrong. George said nothing for a few seconds. Evelyn expected the usual words. It has been years. You have to move forward. Henry would want you to use the light. But George said none of those things. He looked toward the empty chair, then back at Evelyn. I understand, he said, and Evelyn believed him. The next evening, rain began shortly before sunset. Evelyn was closing her curtains. She noticed George crossing the street. He walked up her path, bent down beside the bottom step, then walked away. He never knocked. Curious. Evelyn opened the door. There, beside the step, was a small battery lantern. Its light was soft. Not bright enough to fill the whole porch, just enough to mark the walkway. Beside it was a folded piece of paper. Evelyn picked it up. 6 words. You don't have to use his. Evelyn stood there for a long time, because George had understood something that no one else had. Evelyn did not hate light. She did not hate visitors. She simply was not ready to turn Henry's light into something ordinary. So George had not repaired it. He had not replaced it. He had not asked her to change. Instead, he gave her another light, a light with no memories attached to it, a light that did not ask her to forget anything. That night, Evelyn carried the little lantern inside. The following evening, she placed it outside again. And the evening after that, she did the same. For the next few weeks, the little lantern appeared every night. The old porch lamp above the door remained dark, but the small glow beside the steps changed something. A neighbor walking her dog stopped to say hello. Evelyn talked with her for 5 minutes. A few days later, 2 children collecting canned food for a community drive came to her door. This time, they did not walk past the house. Evelyn gave them 4 cans from her pantry. One Saturday morning, George found Evelyn outside, cutting dead stems from an old flower bed. Thinking about tomatoes, he asked. Maybe 2 plants, Evelyn replied. George raised an eyebrow. Henry would be disappointed. Evelyn laughed. Henry isn't the one who had to give them away. Spring arrived. Evelyn planted 3 tomato plants. By summer, there were 5. She started sitting on the porch again. Not every day, not for hours, just sometimes. Some evenings, she sat alone. Other times, George stood across the street, calling out comments about the weather. Nothing changed overnight. There were still evenings when Evelyn closed the door early. There were still days when a memory caught her by surprise, and she wanted quiet. George never treated those days as failures. Then, nearly a year after George placed that small lantern by her steps, an autumn storm came through the neighborhood. George had been helping an older neighbor repair a loose gate. He stayed later than he planned. By the time he walked home, the rain was heavy, and the street was dark. Evelyn saw him from her window. Without thinking, she stepped into the hallway. Her hand reached for the porch light switch. Then, she stopped. For a moment, she could almost hear Henry's voice. It's so you somebody's waiting. Evelyn looked through the window. George was crossing the street, and suddenly, those old words meant something different. They did not belong only to the past. Evelyn placed her fingers on the switch, and turned on the light. Warm yellow light filled the porch. George stopped in the rain. He looked toward Evelyn's house. She stood behind the glass. Neither of them waved. Neither of them needed to. George simply smiled. And Evelyn left the porch light on, until he reached his front door. The The next evening, she turned it on again, not because she had forgotten Henry, not because the memories hurt less, but because she finally understood something. Remembering the person who once waited for you does not mean you can never become the person waiting for someone else. Sometimes, healing does not mean replacing what we lost, sometimes it simply means finding a gentle new purpose for the love that remains. If this story touched you, comment, "Kindness lives here." And if there was ever a small object, a routine, or an ordinary place that carried a special memory for you, share that story in the comments, because someone reading it may understand more than you realize.